Story 1. I was a university student in Malaysia, cramming for my final exams. It wasn't uncommon for me to stay up until the early hours of the morning, burning the midnight oil in my tiny dormitory. My room was on the third floor, directly opposite a block of flats. The view wasn't much, mostly dark windows and the occasional silhouette of someone moving inside. But it gave me a strange comfort. It felt like I wasn't completely alone. That night was no different. I had been working through my notes, battling sleep with cups of instant coffee. The fluorescent bulb above my desk buzzed faintly, adding to the tension in the otherwise silent room. Around 2 a.m., I finally hit a wall. My eyes felt heavy, my focus slipping, and I decided to take a short break. I walked to the window to get some air. The moment I pushed it open, a gust of cold wind rushed in, making me shiver. It was odd because Malaysia's nights were usually humid, even at that hour. I leaned out slightly, taking in the empty street below. The flats opposite were as silent as ever, their windows darkened like lifeless eyes staring back at me. Then I saw it. At first I thought my exhausted brain was playing tricks on me. A figure, pale and faintly glowing, was gliding across the street below. It was human-shaped, but semi-transparent, almost like a wisp of smoke in the shape of a woman. It moved slowly, deliberately, its feet never quite touching the ground. My heart hammered against my chest as I stood frozen, gripping the windowsill. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of the light, maybe a reflection, but the figure moved with an eerie fluidity, and there was something about its presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just a shape, it felt like something. The figure paused directly below me, and though it had no distinct face, I swear it looked up. A chill swept over me, not from the wind, but from the weight of its unseen gaze. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I gathered the courage to look again, it was moving again, toward one of the flats. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't just any flat, it was the one where my friend Farah lived. The figure didn't knock or open the door. It simply vanished through it, as if the wood and concrete were nothing but air. I slammed my window shut and drew the curtains. My mind raced, desperate for a rational explanation. Maybe I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Maybe it was just my imagination, warped by the stress of finals. I convinced myself that there had to be an explanation, though deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't mention it to anyone. But curiosity got the better of me, and during lunch, I casually brought it up with Farah. "Did you have any visitors last night?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Farah frowned, her spoon hovering over her bowl of noodles. "Number why?" I hesitated. "I just thought I saw someone outside your flat around 2 a.m. Her expression darkened immediately. She set her spoon down and leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you messing with me?" "No," I said, feeling a pit form in my stomach. "Why would I?" Farah glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned even closer. "A woman used to live in my flat," she began, her tone heavy with unease. "Years ago, she hung herself in the living room." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind flashed back to the figure gliding across the street, disappearing through Farah's door. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. She shrugged, though her eyes betrayed her discomfort. "I didn't think it mattered. The landlord said it happened a long time ago, and nothing strange has ever happened to me." I wanted to tell her what I saw, to warn her, but the words caught in my throat. A part of me still clung to the hope that it was all in my head. I didn't want to scare her or make myself look foolish. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. The figure, the cold wind, the way it seemed to look at me. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams of shadowy figures and silent stares. Farah moved out of that flat a few months later, though she never said why. As for me, I never saw the figure again, but the memory of that night has stayed with me. I don't know what I saw, and maybe I never will. All I know is that sometimes there are things in this world that can't be explained, things that make you question what's real and what's not. Story 2. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I heard stories. Plenty of them. But I always thought they were just that. Stories. Until that night. It was a campfire night at school. You know, one of those nights where they try to force you into bonding activities, singing cheesy songs, roasting marshmallows and all that. My friends and I, there were 5 of us, weren't having any of it. The whole thing felt lame, so we decided to sneak off after dinner. We ended up loitering outside our classroom block. The campfire was happening way off on the other side of the school, and the place was eerily quiet. It was dark too, save for the faint yellowish glow of a few streetlights scattered around the compound. We leaned against the walls, cracking jokes, talking about stupid stuff, and occasionally glancing over our shoulders to make sure no teacher was patrolling the area. The classroom block itself was pitch dark. All the lights were off, and the long corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel of shadows. None of us wanted to step inside. Why would we? But we weren't scared. It was just weirdly quiet, that's all. We were standing there, laughing about something I can't even remember now, when one of the classroom lights suddenly flickered on. It was the room directly facing us, at the far end of the block. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly, casting that cold, sterile glow. We all froze. "What the hell?" Ravi whispered, his voice barely audible. "Probably a student," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "Who the hell would go into a dark classroom at this hour?" "Maybe it's a teacher," Priya suggested, though she sounded uncertain. We stood there for a few moments, staring at the glowing room, waiting for someone to appear at the window or come out the door. But no one did. "Should we check it out?" Kieran asked. He was trying to sound brave, but I could hear the slight tremor in his voice. "Hell no," I shot back. "Why would we?" "Because it's weird," Ravi said, "and I'm not going to be the guy who runs off over a stupid light." He started walking toward the classroom, and the rest of us reluctantly followed. None of us wanted to admit we were scared, even though our nerves were wound tight. The closer we got, the louder the fluorescent buzz seemed to grow. It felt like it was drilling into my skull. When we reached the doorway, we hesitated. The room was empty, or at least it looked empty. Desks and chairs were arranged neatly in rows. The blackboard at the front was clean, and the air smelled faintly of chalk and dust. But there was no sign of anyone. "See? Nothing," Priya said, trying to sound casual. "Probably just a short circuit." "Yeah," Kieran said, though he didn't sound convinced. But then Ravi pointed toward the back of the room. "What's that?" he whispered. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. There, in the far corner of the classroom, was a tall metal filing cabinet, and on top of it, barely visible in the fluorescent glare, were a pair of legs. They were swinging, back and forth, like someone was casually sitting up there, kicking their feet like a child on a swing. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. The cabinet was huge, easily 6 or 7 feet tall. There was no way anyone could climb up there without a ladder or something to stand on. "What the?" Priya started, but her voice trailed off, and then it moved. Whoever, or whatever, was on top of the cabinet leaned forward, just enough for us to see ahead. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her hair was wild and matted, hanging in clumps over her face. But the worst part was her eyes. They were wide and unblinking, gleaming with something that wasn't quite human. She grinned at us, a wide, toothy grin that stretched far too much. And then she said, "Peekaboo." Her voice was high-pitched and sing-songy, like a nursery rhyme gone horribly wrong. And then she started laughing, this awful, hysterical laugh that echoed off the walls, filling the room and spilling out into the corridor. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. We ran. I don't remember who bolted first, but within seconds we were all sprinting down the corridor, our footsteps pounding against the tiles. My chest was tight, my lungs burning, but I didn't dare stop. I could still hear the laughter, chasing us, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was right behind me. When we finally reached the campfire area, we collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The laughter was gone. The school felt normal again, just the distant chatter of students and the crackling of the fire. No one spoke for a long time. I think we were all too shaken to say anything. Finally, Ravi broke the silence. Did you see her?" he whispered. We all nodded. No one's going to believe us, Priya said, her voice barely audible. She was right. We didn't tell anyone. Not that night. Not ever. Story 3. I still can't explain what happened that day, no matter how many times I replay it in my head. My name's Adnan, and this happened back when I was in secondary school. I lived in a small, quiet town where nothing ever really happened. The school was old, like something out of a horror movie. Peeling paint, creaky floors, and a dimly lit basement no one dared to enter. But the toilets, they were something else entirely. They felt wrong. Every student whispered rumors about them, but no one could agree on why. It was a regular Thursday afternoon. The bell had just rung, and me and 3 of my friends, Imran, Samir, and Fadil, decided to skip assembly and hang out in the bathroom for a laugh. You know how it is when you're young and stupid. Anything beats sitting through some teacher droning on about punctuality. We'd been in there maybe 5 minutes, joking around, when the atmosphere shifted. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The air felt colder, heavy almost, and the sound of our laughter seemed to echo strangely, like the walls were sucking it in. Even Imran, who always acted like the tough guy, started glancing at the door. "Bro, this place feels weird today," Fadil muttered, leaning against the sink. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried in the silence. "You're such a baby," Imran scoffed, though he didn't look as confident as usual. "It's just a toilet, man." Samir laughed nervously. "Yeah, stop making it creepy. Let's just chill for a bit and leave." But then it happened. It started as a scraping noise, faint but distinct, like nails dragging along the tiles. We all froze. I swear my heart started hammering so hard I thought it had burst. What the hell is that?" Samir asked, his voice shaking. The sound came from the far end of the row of cubicles, the one we all instinctively avoided. It wasn't the first time weird things had been whispered about that particular stall. Some kids said they'd heard crying from inside when no one was there. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving under the door. But until that day, I thought it was all just stories. Imran, of course, tried to act brave. "Probably just a rat or something," he said, stepping toward the sound. "Don't," I said quickly. He stopped, but before any of us could say another word, the door of the last cubicle creaked open just a crack. Not all the way, just enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Yo, who's in there?" Imran called out, his voice cracking slightly. No answer. And then we saw it. A finger, just one, slowly slid out through the gap in the door. It wasn't human. I don't care what anyone says. No human has fingers like that. It was long, unnaturally thin, and a sickly yellow, like the skin was decayed. The nail was the worst part. Brown, jagged, and curling at the edges, like it hadn't been cut in decades. It tapped the edge of the door, once, twice, like it was trying to get our attention. "Oh shit," Samir whispered, backing up so fast he nearly tripped over the sink. "What the hell is that?" Fadil gasped, his face pale. Even Imran, the so-called tough guy, looked like he was about to pass out. This isn't funny, man," he stammered. I don't know what came over me, but something about that finger filled me with this primal fear, like every part of my body was screaming run. Instead, I did the stupidest thing possible. I stepped forward and kicked the door. The sound of my foot slamming into the wood echoed like a gunshot, and for a split second, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the door swung open, slamming against the stall divider with a force that made the walls tremble. There was nothing inside. No one. No finger. Just an empty, filthy toilet bowl. We didn't wait to investigate. I yelled, "Run!" And we all bolted, shoving each other out of the way in our panic to get to the door. I swear I've never moved that fast in my life. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air under the afternoon sun. "What the hell was that?" Fadil shouted, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I said, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. Imran, for once, didn't have anything to say. He just stood there, staring at the school like he was afraid to go back in. We never spoke about it again. Not really. Anytime someone brought it up, we'd laugh it off or change the subject. But I could tell it haunted all of us. None of us ever used that toilet again, and I'm pretty sure Samir started holding it in until he got home, To this day, I don't know what we saw. Was it a prank? A hallucination? Something worse? I've tried to rationalize it, but the memory of that finger still gives me chills. And the way it tapped on the door, like it knew we were there, like it was waiting for us. I haven't stepped foot in that school since I graduated, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplained. Story 4. It was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. You know, the kind where a stray dog wandering through the school gates made the local news. I was a senior in high school, living on the outskirts of this sleepy place, where boredom was the only real threat to anyone's sanity. Or so I thought. The first time I noticed the chair, it didn't seem like much. Just a beaten-up white coffee shop chair sitting in the middle of an empty field near the school fence. It was old, rusted around the edges and missing some paint, like it had been left out in the elements for years. I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it if Mr. Owens, our English teacher, hadn't pointed it out during class. It was after the last bell rang, and most of us were slouched in our seats, waiting for the usual end-of-day pep talk. Mr. Owens, with his trademark smirk, tapped the window with a knuckle and said, "Looks like Charlie decided to skip school today for a little outdoor reflection." The class chuckled nervously. Charlie wasn't there that day. He'd been out sick, or so we'd been told. But the joke landed well enough. We all glanced out the window, expecting nothing. But there it was, the chair. It stood perfectly still in the field, facing the school, like someone had deliberately placed it there. No tracks leading up to it, no sign of how it got there. Just the chair. "That's weird," Sarah muttered from behind me. I didn't say anything, but she was right. The field was flat, empty, and fenced off on 3 sides. It wasn't the kind of place where random furniture just appeared. I told myself someone probably dragged it out there as a prank, but something about it gave me the creeps. The next day, Charlie was still absent, and the chair was still there. Only it wasn't in the same spot. It was closer. Not by much, just a few feet, but enough that you could tell. It wasn't facing the school anymore either. It had turned slightly, almost like it was angling toward the fence. We all noticed it during lunch, and the vibe was different this time, more hushed. A few of us stood by the window, staring out at the field while others whispered about it. "Did someone move it?" Kevin asked, scratching the back of his neck. "Why would anyone do that?" Sarah shot back. "It's not like we can even get out there without climbing the fence." "Maybe the wind pushed it," I suggested, though even I didn't believe it. The chair was too heavy for that. Mr. Owens walked in and caught us gawking. "What's this? You kids scared of an old chair now?" he teased, but there was an edge to his voice, like he was trying to convince himself it was nothing. By the end of the day, the chair had moved again. This time it was almost at the fence, just a few feet away. It was turned slightly toward the school now, like it was watching us. Nobody laughed about it anymore. The jokes had dried up, and a heavy silence settled over the halls. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I dreamed of the chair, of its cold, rusted legs scraping against the ground as it dragged itself closer and closer to the fence. When I woke up, my sheets were damp with sweat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. When Charlie finally came back to school, the chair was gone. Completely gone. Not pushed back to the middle of the field, not tipped over or broken, just gone. At first, we thought maybe the groundskeeper had taken it, but when we asked, he looked at us like we were crazy. "Chair? What chair?" he said. We tried to let it go, but things felt off after that. Charlie wasn't himself. He'd always been loud and kind of a class clown, but that day he was quiet, almost hollow. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "What's up with you?" I asked him during lunch. He shrugged, barely looking at me. "Nothing, just tired." But it wasn't just tiredness. There was something else, something darker. I caught him staring out the window a few times, his gaze fixed on the empty field where the chair had been. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how the chair had moved on its own, how it had disappeared the moment Charlie came back. Around midnight, I got up and looked out my bedroom window, which faced the school. The field was dark and empty, but for some reason my chest tightened. I closed the curtains and crawled back into bed, forcing myself to forget about it. The next morning, Charlie wasn't in class again. When I asked around, no one seemed to know where he was. "He hasn't been answering his phone," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I went to his house, but his mom said he never came home last night." I didn't have a response to that. None of us did. We just sat there, staring at the empty seat where Charlie should have been, the same way we'd stared at that chair in the field. He never came back. To this day, no one knows what happened to him. His parents filed a missing persons report, but the cops didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, just nothing. The chair never reappeared either. Sometimes when I walk past the school, I glance out at that field, half expecting to see it sitting there, waiting. I don't know what it was or why it came, but I'll never forget how it felt. That creeping sense of dread, like something was watching us, waiting for the right moment. And I'll never forget Charlie's face the day he came back, like he knew something we didn't. Story 5. It happened during my last year at school camp, a memory I would rather forget, but it clings to me like a shadow. I was one of the senior prefects, and as part of my duties, I had to make sure no one went to places deemed off limits. One of those places was the top floor toilet beside the old arts classroom. From the very first day, our teachers were clear. That toilet is strictly off limits. Use the others on the lower floors. They gave no explanation, just that flat, cold warning, repeated with an edge of something more. It wasn't like them to be so firm, but we listened, or at least most of us did. By the second evening, the camp had settled into its chaotic rhythm. Kids running around, teachers barking orders, everyone tired but buzzing from the excitement. I was making rounds, ensuring everyone stayed in their dorms after lights out. That's when I noticed that 2 boys, Forrest and Johan, famous for their stupidity, were missing. I found them at the end of the corridor, whispering and snickering like they were up to no good. "Oi!" I called out. "What are you 2 up to?" They froze like deer caught in headlights. Then Johan laughed nervously. "Nothing, man. Just needed to pee." "Then use the toilet downstairs," I said, narrowing my eyes. "We, wanted to check out the one on the top floor," Ferris blurted, and Johan elbowed him hard in the ribs. "Are you stupid?" I snapped. "Didn't you hear what the teacher said? Stay away from that place." "Relax, we didn't go in," Johan said, grinning, but something in his tone felt forced. I didn't trust them, but before I could press further, a teacher called me over to help with an issue in another dorm. I had no choice but to let them go, but their smug faces stayed with me. It was an hour later when the screaming started. It came from above, sharp and raw, cutting through the silence like a knife. Everyone froze. The teachers, the students, we all looked at each other, wide-eyed, before someone shouted, "Top floor!" I was the first to sprint up the stairs, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The corridor was dark, the lights flickering like something out of a bad horror movie. The air was heavy, colder than it should have been. Ferris and Johan came tearing out of the toilet, their faces pale as death, their eyes wide with terror. They nearly knocked me over in their panic. "What the hell happened?" I yelled, grabbing Johan by the arm. He was trembling so hard I thought he might collapse. We saw something," he stammered. "What?" "Boots," Ferris whispered, his voice barely audible. "What are you talking about?" They looked at each other, then back at me, their expressions so haunted that a chill ran down my spine. "We went in," Johan admitted, his voice shaking, "just to look around. We thought it was a joke, you know? The whole don't go up there thing. But then we went into the cubicle." "Why the hell would you do that?" I snapped, but they ignored me, lost in their terror. "We were joking around," Ferris continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "But then, under the door, we saw boots." "Boots?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "Black boots," Johan said, his voice breaking. "Just standing there. We thought it was a teacher, that we were busted, so we stayed quiet, waiting for them to say something." "But they didn't," Ferris cut in, his voice rising. "They just stood there, for so long, too long. So we opened the door, and," I prompted, my throat dry. "There was no one there," Johan whispered. "Just the boots." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean, just the boots?" They were just sitting there, perfectly still, like someone had been wearing them, but vanished, Faris said, his voice cracking. We ran. We didn't look back. By now the teachers had arrived, their faces grim. They herded everyone downstairs, refusing to answer any of our frantic questions. Faris and Johann were taken aside and spoken to in hushed tones. The rest of us were sent to bed, but sleep was impossible. The next morning, it was like nothing had happened. The teachers refused to discuss it, brushing off any mention of the incident with sharp glares and clipped tones. Faris and Johann, normally loud and obnoxious, were silent, their faces drawn and pale. I cornered them during breakfast, determined to get answers. "What aren't you telling me?" I demanded. They looked at each other, then at me, their fear palpable. "There was something else," Johann finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "When we ran out, we heard footsteps, heavy ones, like someone was following us. But when we turned around," he trailed off, his eyes glistening with tears. "There was nothing there," Faris finished for him, his voice hollow. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell them it was all in their heads that they were imagining things. But the look in their eyes stopped me. The rest of the camp passed uneventfully, but the atmosphere was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. No one went near the top floor, and the teachers kept a watchful eye on everyone. When camp ended, I thought I could put it behind me, convince myself it was just a prank or a shared hallucination. But sometimes late at night, I think about those boots, about the terror in Faris and Johann's eyes, and about the fact that when I went up to the top floor to check that night, I heard footsteps too. Story 6. I grew up in a small, forgotten town surrounded by endless woods. Nothing much happened there, and for the most part, life was predictable, mundane even. My high school was just as dull, one building, a cracked basketball court, and a field that no one ever used because it backed into the forest. That day started like any other. It was spring, and the seniors were preparing for their class photo. The entire school had been herded out onto the field to stand in the sun, while Mr. Henders, the biology teacher and part-time photographer, fussed with his camera. I was a junior, so we stood off to the side, watching as the seniors jostled each other and tried to act cool for the camera. It was a warm day and the air felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. We'd all noticed it, this strange pressure, like something just wasn't right. But no one said anything. We didn't need to. We were all just waiting for the photo to be over, so we could get back inside and escape the creeping unease. "All right, everyone," Mr. Henders shouted, raising his hand. "On 3, smile." The seniors cheered, threw their arms around each other and posed. The camera clicked, and that should have been it. But it wasn't. Later that afternoon, just before the last period, the announcement came over the intercom. "Will all students from the senior class please report to the main hall? This is urgent." I remember exchanging glances with my friends, confused. Urgent? What could possibly be urgent in a place like this? Maybe someone finally snapped and told Mr. Henders what we all think of his artistic angles, my friend Sarah joked. We laughed, but it was uneasy. The rest of us were sent to the cafeteria to wait. Time dragged on, and the seniors didn't come back. Then one by one, the teachers started filing out of the building. No explanation, no dismissal, just gone. By the time the principal appeared, his face pale and his usual stiff demeanor replaced with something that looked almost like fear, we knew something was very wrong. "Everyone, go home," he said, his voice trembling. "Grab your things, do not wait. Just go straight home." "What's going on?" someone shouted. He didn't answer. He just kept repeating, "Go home, please." We didn't need to be told twice. The air outside felt heavier than before, and the sky was a weird shade of gray. Sarah and I walked in silence for most of the way. I think we were too scared to ask the questions we really wanted answers to. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see, I don't know, something. But there was nothing there. The rumors started that night. Someone in our group chat said they heard from their older brother, one of the seniors, that Mr. Henders had called them all into the hall to show them the class photo. At first, it seemed normal. Everyone was there, grinning and waving, just like they had been earlier. But then someone pointed it out. There was a shadow in the back row, just behind Claire Jennings, the class president. It wasn't a person, at least not one anyone recognized. It was tall, taller than anyone in the photo, and its face wasn't a face. It was just black, like the shape of a head, but without features. At first, they thought it was just a glitch. You know, some kind of camera error. But when Mr. Henders zoomed in, it got worse. Its hand, or what looked like a hand, was resting on Claire's shoulder. She hadn't noticed it at the time. No one had. But in the photo, she was standing stock still, her grin frozen, like she knew something was wrong. The story got weirder from there. One of the seniors, Jason, swore up and down that he'd felt something cold brush past him during the photo. He thought it was just the wind, but now he wasn't so sure. Another girl, Mia, said she'd heard whispering, faint and low, right before the camera clicked. She thought it was her friends playing a prank, until she saw the picture. By the next morning, half the seniors were out sick. The school was closed for maintenance, but we all knew it was a lie. No one was talking about it, not officially, but you could feel the tension in town. People were scared, though no one would admit it. Claire was the worst off. She'd been fine when she got home, according to her mom, but by midnight she was burning up with a fever. She kept mumbling about the shadow, saying it was in her room, standing at the foot of her bed. Her parents thought she was hallucinating until they saw the bruises on her shoulder. Dark, finger-shaped marks, exactly where the shadow's hand had been in the photo. We didn't see Mr. Henders after that day. Some people said he'd left town, but others claimed he'd been sent to a psych ward. Apparently, he couldn't stop talking about the photo, about how he deleted it, but it kept showing up on his laptop, his phone, even printed out on his desk. I don't know if that part's true, but I do know this. No one ever saw the picture again. Not the seniors, not the teachers, not even Claire's parents. It was gone, erased from every device and memory card. But the fear didn't go away. Story 7. The camp was supposed to be just another school adventure. One of those bonding experiences everyone dreaded, but secretly looked forward to. My secondary school wasn't like most others. Rumors about its dark past ran wild. Students whispered that it used to be a cemetery, and to be honest, the satellite image didn't help. The three main buildings eerily resembled RIP when viewed from above. It was the kind of thing we laughed about in the daylight, but never brought up at night. It was during one of these camps, amidst the chaos of CCA activities, that something happened. Something I still can't explain. We were playing Running Man late at night. You know the game. Run, hide, tag, rinse, repeat. My group of 4 was stationed near Block C, a building that nobody particularly liked being around. The air felt colder there, heavier even. But it wasn't the air that unnerved me. It was the room. Room 304. This room had a reputation of its own, whispered about between students year after year. Some said they heard voices. Others claimed to see shadows through the frosted glass when the room was supposed to be locked. That night it was no different. It stood at the end of the hallway, its door firmly shut and the light off. Nobody ever entered. Nobody even had the keys. The game was intense. We were sprinting through the dimly lit corridors when it happened. I didn't hear it at first. My friend May did. She froze mid-run, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We stopped, the sound faint but unmistakable. A piano. Someone was playing a melody inside room 304. At first it was distant, almost like a phantom of a tune carried on the breeze. But then, as we crept closer, it grew clearer. The Pink Panther theme. My heart raced. It was an eerie choice for a ghost, but I knew that song well. One of my CCA mates, Tim, loved to play it during breaks. He joked about how it made everything feel sneaky. But Tim wasn't here. He had gone home hours ago. My throat tightened. "Maybe it's just a recording?" one of my teammates whispered, but even he didn't sound convinced. May, ever the skeptic, marched up to the door and knocked. The sound echoed down the empty hallway. The piano stopped instantly. Dead silence. My stomach churned as I stared at the door, half expecting it to swing open. It didn't. May knocked again, harder this time. "Tim, if you're messing around, it's not funny," she called out. No response. She turned to us, her eyes narrowing. Someone's in there. I don't think anyone can be, I said, swallowing hard. That room's been locked for ages. Nobody's got the key. May wasn't buying it. We'll see about that. She pulled out her phone and dialed Tim. The rest of us stood frozen, too scared to speak. When he picked up, his groggy voice came through the speaker. Why are you calling me at this hour? He mumbled. Are you inside 304? May asked bluntly, ignoring his tone. 304. What the hell? I'm at home, he replied, annoyed. Why would I be there? Did you leave the piano on or something? She pushed. Tim sighed. The piano in 304 hasn't worked in years. The keys are busted. Everyone knows that. I felt the blood drain from my face. Tim hung up, and we stood in stunned silence. If the piano didn't work, who or what was playing it? Before we could decide our next move, something else happened. A single note, deep and hollow, rang out from behind the door. Then another, and another. Slowly, methodically, the melody began again, louder this time. None of us moved. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pinning us to the ground. The hallway, once dim, now seemed suffocatingly dark. My breathing quickened, and I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. Let's go, I whispered, barely able to find my voice. May, for all her bravado, nodded. We backed away step by step, the piano notes following us like a haunting echo. By the time we reached the stairwell, the sound had stopped again. No one looked back. When we regrouped with the others, we told them what had happened. Most laughed it off, saying we were imagining things. But there was one person who didn't laugh. A senior. His face turned serious as he listened. Room 304, huh? He said quietly. Yeah, why? I asked, dreading the answer. He hesitated before speaking. A few years ago, a teacher used to play the piano in there. He loved the Pink Panther theme. Played it every chance he got. One day during camp, he stayed back to practice late into the night. The next morning, they found him inside. Heart attack. He was slumped over the piano. The room seemed to spin. You're joking, I said, though I knew he wasn't. I'm not, he replied, his voice low. They locked the room after that. Said it was out of order. Nobody's supposed to go in. And that piano, he trailed off, his eyes dark. It hasn't worked since. That was the last time I went near Block C. To this day, the memory of those notes haunts me. I don't know who or what was in room 304 that night. All I know is that I'll never forget the way the music stopped when we knocked, as if it was waiting for us to leave. Some things are better left undisturbed. Story 8. I was a student in the pioneer batch of my school, and at the time, there were only 2 grades, mine and the juniors. It was a small, quiet place back then, almost too quiet. Sometimes I'd convince myself that I liked it that way. Fewer distractions, right? But now looking back, I realize how unnerving it could get, especially when you were alone. This happened during my second year. It was a typical afternoon after classes, around 2 p.m., and I stayed back to work on an art project. Our art room was a peculiar space, divided into 2 classrooms by one of those folding partitions. When closed, it separated us completely. When open, it turned the room into one big hall. That day, the partition was only halfway open. The junior batch was using the first room, chattering away as they wrapped up their work, while I was in the second room, alone. It was quiet on my side, save for the occasional shuffle of my movements and the dull hum of distant voices through the partition. I was silk screening, a messy process that required a lot of paint. If you've ever done it, you'd know it's not something you can rush through. I had spread out my materials, engrossed in the slow, repetitive rhythm of my work, barely aware of how time slipped by. The art room was locked from the corridor side that afternoon. The only way in was through the partially open partition. None of the juniors ventured into my space. They never did. Back then, seniors were like ghosts to them. They avoided us unless they absolutely had to, and honestly, I liked the solitude. After finishing the main part of my project, I moved on to cleaning the silkscreen template. It was coated with thick layers of paint, and I needed to rinse it thoroughly. There was a sink at the far corner of the room, near the partition. I turned the tap on and placed the silk screen under the running water, letting the steady flow wash away the stubborn residue. Leaving the water running, I went back to my table to start tidying up my workspace. A good 5 minutes passed, and I was still alone. I remember hearing the faint voices of the juniors growing quieter. They were probably packing up to leave. The air felt heavy, though. It wasn't the kind of silence that's calming. It was the kind that pressed on your ears, making every small sound seem louder than it was. When I returned to the sink to check on the silk screen, the water had stopped running. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a water supply issue. It happened occasionally in our school. A random outage, nothing strange about that. I reached for the tap casually, intending to turn it back on, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was stuck, impossibly tight, as if someone had screwed it shut with brute force. I tried again, gripping it harder, twisting with all my strength, but it refused to move. That's when I felt it. That creeping, cold sensation at the back of my neck, the kind you get when you know you're being watched. Instinctively, I looked up, scanning the empty room through the reflection in the sink's chrome surface. Nothing. Is someone there? My voice came out steadier than I felt. No answer. The partition door hadn't moved. No footsteps, no sound. I turned back to the tap, muttering under my breath, "Must be the stupid plumbing." But the second my fingers touched the tap handle again, something shifted. It turned effortlessly, as if it had never been stuck. Water gushed out, startling me so much I stumbled back. My heart was pounding now. I quickly rinsed the silk screen and turned off the tap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced around the room again, my eyes darting between the shadows and corners. Nothing moved. Still, I couldn't stop the chill creeping up my spine. Then I noticed the floor beneath the sink. It was wet, not just from the water splashing down, but smeared with streaks of what looked like faint red. Paint, I told myself. It had to be paint. I'd been working with red earlier, but why did it trail away from the sink, leading toward the partition, the junior batch? Maybe one of them had wandered over. Maybe they were trying to mess with me. I stepped toward the partition, my footsteps soft against the tiled floor. The streaks of red faded the closer I got, disappearing just before the halfway open door. I peeked through. The other room was empty, silent. The juniors had left. "Hello?" My voice echoed, but only silence answered. I felt a sudden urge to get out of there. I turned back, hastily gathering my materials. As I packed up, I swore I heard a faint whisper, indistinct, like a breath brushing against my ear. I froze, clutching the edge of the table. It came again, this time clearer, but still too soft to make out. It wasn't coming from the partition, it was behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. My pulse thundered in my ears as I shoved the last of my tools into my bag, grabbed the silkscreen, and bolted toward the door. My hands fumbled with the lock for a moment before it gave way. The corridor outside was blindingly bright compared to the dim art room, and the warmth of the sun hit me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I was halfway to the school gate, my breath ragged and my chest tight. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my classmates, not the teachers. Even now I can't explain it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I was tired and reading too much into something mundane. But every time I think about that moment, the silence, the stuck tap, the whisper, I feel the same cold chill run down my spine. I never stayed in the art room alone again. Story 9. I grew up moving from one place to another, thanks to my dad's career in the military. By the time I was 10, I had learned to adapt to new surroundings quickly. New towns, new schools, new people. When we moved to Uxbridge in 1995, I thought it would be no different. Whitehall School, my temporary home for the year, was an old building with winding staircases and creaky floors. It had the kind of character you'd expect from a place that had seen decades of students pass through its halls. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary. The school had that peculiar, musty smell of old wood and damp books, and the teachers were kind enough. I didn't make close friends, but that was fine. I had my books, my imagination, and a knack for staying out of trouble. One day, during a break between classes, I was asked to fetch a workbook from the small storage room upstairs. The room was across the corridor from the main classrooms, tucked away in an area that always felt oddly quiet. I hadn't been inside before, but I'd walked past it plenty of times. It was one of those places you barely notice, a mundane detail in the backdrop of school life. When I pushed the door open, the room smelled of paper and old ink. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books and folders, their spines faded from years of use. A single narrow window let in a shaft of light, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. It was quiet, too quiet. The muffled sounds of kids laughing and teachers talking in the nearby classrooms seemed to fade as I stepped inside. At first, nothing felt wrong. I scanned the shelves, searching for the workbook. The silence pressed against my ears, heavy and all-encompassing. As I reached for a book, I felt it, a shift in the air, a weight that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, like the way a room feels when someone else enters without making a sound. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind me. The room was empty. My heart began to beat faster, but I told myself I was being silly. "You're alone. Stop imagining things." I shook off the unease and returned to the task at hand, running my fingers along the spines of the books. The sensation came again, stronger this time. A presence, like someone standing just out of sight. My scalp prickled. I spun around again, my pulse now hammering in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. It sounded small in the confined space, swallowed by the stillness. No answer. I felt stupid, embarrassed even, but the unease was growing, coiling in my chest like a tightening spring. I glanced toward the door, wondering if I should leave and come back later. Then suddenly, the atmosphere changed. The room grew colder, not a little cooler, but biting cold, like stepping outside on a frosty morning. My breath hitched as I saw my exhalation mist in the air. That's when the feeling of being watched became undeniable. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone, or something, was there. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but my feet wouldn't move. My eyes darted to every corner of the room, expecting something to leap out. But there was nothing. Just shelves, books, and that narrow window casting its beam of light. Then came the sound, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It didn't come from outside or the hallway. It came from within the room. A shiver coursed down my spine as the whisper grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like 1,000 voices murmuring at once, overlapping and incoherent. That's when I felt it. Pressure on my shoulder, not a touch but a weight, as if someone was leaning in close, too close. I dropped to the floor, curling up between two bookshelves, hugging my knees tightly. My eyes squeezed shut as I tried to block it all out, but the whispers grew louder, echoing in my ears. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Time lost all meaning as I sat there, paralyzed by a terror I couldn't explain. The sensation of being watched didn't fade, it intensified. It felt as if someone was standing directly over me, staring down with an intensity that burned through my closed eyelids. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt heavy, my lungs straining for air. The whispers reached a crescendo, rising to a deafening roar that filled my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. All I could do was press myself deeper into the corner, hoping, praying it would end. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The cold dissipated, the whispers fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifted. I opened my eyes, trembling. The room looked the same as before, ordinary, mundane, but I knew better. Something had been there, something unseen and unexplainable. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I bolted for the door. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop until I was back in the bustling corridor. The moment I stepped out, the unease vanished. Warmth returned to my body, and the faint chatter of students brought me back to reality. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? I wasn't even sure I believed myself. But I never went back to that room, not for the rest of the year. Even passing it in the hallway made my stomach churn and my skin crawl. Story 10. I still don't know what exactly happened that day. Maybe it was the isolation of the school during the holidays, or perhaps it was the strange atmosphere of the backstage area, but something felt wrong. I go to a secondary school that's old, one of those with creaking floors, cracked walls, and stories that are passed around in whispers. The backstage area in particular had this haunting reputation. It was rarely used, so whenever we had to go back there for some task, the unease was always palpable. The male toilet in particular was notorious. It was tucked away at the farthest corner of the hall, behind a faded velvet curtain that was forever stained by time. The toilet was locked, always. It had been that way for as long as I could remember. One afternoon during the school holidays, I was at school running some errands, checking in on the cleaning crew and taking care of some other duties. The entire school was quiet, almost too quiet. I was alone in the halls, the only sound coming from my footsteps echoing through the corridors. The backstage area felt colder than usual, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic. I had no real reason to go to the male toilet that day, but something pulled me toward it. As I approached the door, I could hear the sound of drilling. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint, rhythmic whirring sound. I stopped in my tracks, confusion flooding my mind. No one should have been back here. The toilets were locked, and no one had mentioned any kind of renovation. I leaned closer to the door, straining to hear. The drilling stopped abruptly. For a split second, there was only silence. Then it was followed by a scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard across the floor. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, and glanced around. The hallway was empty. Shaking my head, I told myself it was probably just maintenance, though it didn't explain why no one had mentioned it. I slowly walked past the door, deciding to leave it alone, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. Just as I reached the end of the backstage area, a strange sound made me freeze. It was coming from the female toilet beside the male one. The door was half open, and the small room beyond was used as storage for cleaning supplies. I was about to continue walking when I heard the unmistakable sound of water running. It was faint but unmistakable. Curious and admittedly a little uneasy, I stepped closer. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above. The smell of mildew was stronger here. I could see that the sink was covered with a large brown cardboard box. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. The box looked out of place, almost like it had been thrown there hastily, but I couldn't see why. I pushed the door open further, and that's when I saw it. The water was running, the faucet clear as day, even though the box covered most of the sink. I watched it for a moment, unsure of what to do. The sound of water was unsettling. It wasn't just the sound of water running, but a slow, deliberate sound, as if the tap was being turned just enough to let the water trickle. It was almost as though it was mocking me. I stepped forward to turn off the tap, but then I hesitated. There was something off about this situation. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My breath caught in my throat. The tap didn't just sound like it was running, it felt like it was running at me. My pulse quickened, and a shiver ran down my spine. Before I could make up my mind, the faucet suddenly stopped. The water ceased just like that. I don't know why, but that's when I bolted. I left the backstage area faster than I ever had before, and I didn't stop running until I was out of that corridor. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. My friend had been in the same area earlier that day, and she had felt it too. The oppressive, strange air that settled over the backstage like a cloud. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking about the faucet and the way it had turned off so suddenly. It wasn't normal. There was no explanation for it. Maybe it was some kind of plumbing issue, but I couldn't make sense of it. What disturbed me more was the thought of what could be behind that locked male toilet door. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget about it, but the unease wouldn't let me. One afternoon not long ago, my friend was hanging out with me at school. She was messing around on Snapchat like she always does. She turned on the dog filter and posed for a selfie in front of the curtains near the backstage. I glanced at her phone, distracted by the laughter and the carefree mood. But then her face froze. "Wait, what's that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I looked at the phone. Her dog-filtered face smiled back at her, but what caught my attention was the background. Right next to the curtains, above her head, I saw it. A face, or at least it looked like one. It was partially obscured by the curtains, but there was no mistaking it. two dark eyes peering through the fabric, staring right at us. The face wasn't clear, not exactly. It was as though it was a shadow, but it was unmistakably there. "Is that a glitch?" she asked, her voice trembling. But I didn't think so. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a glitch at all. There was something behind those curtains, something watching us. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow, as I tried to rationalize what I had seen, but I couldn't. We left the backstage area shortly after. We didn't speak much, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words, with something that felt too real, too wrong to ignore. We never went back there after that. Something in that school, in that backstage area, was wrong. I don't know what it was. Maybe it's just the way the old walls creaked at night, or the strange sounds that echoed through the halls. But after everything that happened, the drilling, the faucet, the face in the curtains, I couldn't convince myself that it was just a coincidence, and I haven't been back since. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.